So if you miss one, don't worry, you can catch up on others. So this is about personal biblical finance. It's a class that I was fortunate enough to teach at our church in New York City. The demographics at our church in New York skewed much younger. So I've tried to tailor this a little bit more to, adults, more mature, at different life stages. But some of this may not apply to where you are in life. Some of you may be retired, some of you may be early career, some of you may have grandchildren. So it's going to be somewhat wide and general, but not skewed towards kids that are fresh out of college looking for their first job. Although the last session, if we get there, will be around job searching, resumes, interviewing for people who do want to, and especially some of your teenage kids. That might be a helpful skill. So if I can get this to work. So the intent is, first of all, this morning I'm going to spend most of the time on what I've found is the biblical context for money and personal finance. And I think that's an interesting way to start. And then want to dive into sharing some of the accumulated wisdom. And when I say accumulated, mainly because of mistakes that I made, that we made. But also Jennifer's dad, who worked on Wall Street for a long time, he gave us a lot of advice. And I've tried to pass that on to our kids, but also pass it on to brothers and sisters in Christ, because I think it's timeless wisdom. Want to help you put in place a financial plan. If you don't have a plan, you really don't know where you're going. To hopefully make wiser financial decisions, but just have a plan so you know where you're headed, irrespective of where you are in life. I do want to talk about tithing sacrificially. That's not often a topic that's preached. It's somewhat difficult for a pastor to bring up the topic of money. But I feel that's, as a congregation, that's something we should talk about. And I still am actually treasurer of our church in New York City. So I was the money guy. So I got to have the talk every year. And I think that's one that we should have very candidly and talk about sacrificial giving. And then finally, a reminder that all this is not ours to begin with, it's God's, and how do we return it to God, and the gifts that we've been blessed with in this life, how do we return them for His glory and for the building of His kingdom? So that's really the intent of this series. A disclaimer, I'm not a financial investment professional, so don't sue me. I'm not a tax advisor. Get a tax advisor. Results will vary. But I'll give you kind of averages of how things, have been historically. Past performance of whatever the stock market, et cetera, doesn't guarantee future results. Inflation changes, and tax laws and retirement rules change. They have changed recently. They change almost every administration. But staying on top of those can mean the difference between having a comfortable retirement and maybe a less comfortable retirement. So that's a little disclaimer that I want to put up front. So the Bible talks about money in just about every facet of life possible. Working, earning money, saving money, spending money, tithing money, paying taxes, stewardship of gifts and money, providing money, being generous with the money, planning, parenting, taking care of aging parents, planning for health, preventing bad things from happening, anticipating, investing in education, investing in general, and retiring. The Bible literally covers virtually all of these facets of money. And that's also, one of them is, money does help to enjoy life and to have some fun. I'll get to that at the very end, because there's a lot of things you have to do before you spend the money on fun. So, I want to start with some biblical principles, and the wisdom of my father-in-law will be kind of woven in throughout this, and a lot of our mistakes, and also just some common sense. And I find that our education system doesn't teach kids in middle school or high school home economics, how to balance a checkbook. They probably don't even know what a checkbook is. They don't understand good debt versus bad debt, what a balance sheet is. And these are important financial concepts that give you some common sense things to do and things not to do. And unfortunately, those just aren't taught. And it's hard to catch up if you don't get those in school, unless you get an accounting degree or a finance degree, or self-educate online. So my hope is that I can convey a little bit of that to all of you. This series will be hopefully 4 Sundays. Depends on how much Q&A we have. If we have to end spot on time to let the music folks come up here. The last session I hope will be around job search and your CV or resume and how to help folks get a job or get a new job. But I'm also very happy to spend time offline one-on-one. I've done that already with a number of the folks in the congregation. Happy to do that. My schedule's a little hectic, but I would be delighted to share some personal time with you just to go through your situation, and I've done that with a few folks, and I think that can very often be very, very helpful. So the biblical grounding. The way I try and look at finances is that you are in the business of running you. You're a company. You're no different than a company. And you should treat your household and the finances of your household like a business. It's no different. You have a profit and loss statement, what's called a P&L, right? Because you have income, salary, retirement, whatever that is. You have expenses, you pay taxes. Well, companies do the same thing. You have a balance sheet. Now, that might sound like a technical term, and you have assets. What's that? Well, assets could be savings, so money you have, your home, whatever equity you have in the home, and you have liabilities, debt, credit card debt, mortgage, student debt. And you have also a cash flow statement, which is essentially your lifestyle. What's your cash burn? How much of the income you make that's left over after you've paid taxes and rent, et cetera, do you burn through? These are 3 financial statements that exist for every company in the world. P&L statement, balance sheet, cash flow. And my advice is you need to think of your household, your finances, the same exact way. I know some people like Mark are deep into finance, so hopefully this resonates, but I think it's an important concept to think about. Your house is a business. You're running the house of your family. And it's something you do jointly with a spouse. You've got your kids, grandkids, et cetera, and you have to think through that lens of you're running a business called you. So the areas I want to explore, let me just go back here. Go back one more, sorry. There we go. Today I hope to cover income and tithing once we go through some biblical kind of background. And then we'll hopefully tackle next week expenses and debt, and then maybe taxes and savings, retirement, and then the fun part at the very end. But you're going to see the agenda is going to kind of click through all of these once we go through a number of ground rules that the Bible sets with regards to finance. So the word money is mentioned 140 times in the Bible, 800 times if you add all the other words that are adjacent to it. So gold, silver, wealth, riches, etc. So it's mentioned pretty often. And it turns out that the Bible has a great deal to say about financial matters, probably more than just about any other subject. And if you look at the 500 verses that are on prayer and faith, there are 2,000 verses pertaining to money, which is surprising, right? And about 40% of Jesus' parables have to do with money. Not something most people think about when they think of the Bible. So obviously God has a lot to say about money, and we should heed that and pay attention to what the Bible says about money and wealth and giving. So my little chart, I had to throw a chart in there, but you guys can go check, do all the research you want, but those statistics, as far as I know, are pretty accurate across Old and New Testament. So it's definitely a very valid topic that is not often preached, not often talked about, certainly not through a biblical lens, and one that I'm going to try and bring today. So why is it one of the most talked about topics in the Bible? You could kind of wonder why does Jesus spend so much time on it? Why does God spend so much time on it in the Bible? And it's packed with a lot of truth and revelations that are relevant for everyday issues, and money is an everyday issue in human society and all of our situations. The Word of God is complete. It teaches us, in like all these different aspects of life, relationship and work and character, leadership, and yes, finances are taught in the Bible. And you have to go find them and learn from them and apply that wisdom, but it's very applicable to running personal finances. And there's a very strong biblical influence on the importance of money in society and making good use of it. And I attribute this to the fact that God is a God who's very relevant to guide us in everyday living, and money is part of society. It's not God's intent to leave us blind. Like there's no roadmap, there's no instruction on how to run finances, and it's found in the Bible. And I'll go through some of the quotes that I found, and I'm sure there are many, many other ones that are in the Bible. Jesus, in his ministry, spoke a lot about money. I mentioned 40% of his parables, but financial management. And you can think of all these examples, people he ran into, parables that he gave that apply to personal finances. King Solomon also had a lot of wisdom and instruction on how to invest. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And the Bible literally covers just about everything when it comes to finances. Maybe not crypto, but the equivalent, investing, right, and speculating. And those are topics that are covered in the Bible. So you don't have to read this, but these are a lot of the quotes that I found. And you'll get a copy of these slides, so if you want to go and find these, but there are some, I think, just some fantastic quotes. Storing up choice food in olive oil, fools gulp theirs down, being without knowledge, you're a fool, so you have to educate yourself, and finance is one of those areas. You can just see, all of these topics are covered, Old Testament, New Testament. I'll point out a few here that are very specific on finances, but it is filled with financial analogies and advice and recommendations on how to be a good Christian with your money. This one from Matthew, I think, is very relevant. What we have here on earth, these treasures, they're temporal, right? They're God's to begin with, and we don't bring them to heaven. And so storing treasures up in heaven is the most important thing. You still do need treasure every day down here to run life, but you can't let that define you. And for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Money can't be the object of your heart. It's a useful instrument, but it's not what we need to focus on. The parable of the 5 talents, and this is about investing. The gentleman here gives 5 talents of coins, and then 2, and then 1, and he comes back, and what have people done with it? Well, the first 2 actually doubled the money. Pretty good return on investment, right? 5 talents comes back with 10. Second one has 2 talents, comes back with 2. The last one took the talent and buried it. And he's the one who gets his head handed to him. He's the one who's basically told you're a fool. So not investing is not Christian, is not biblical, right? You are supposed to invest the treasures that you were given, the gifts that you were given. So this, I think, is a very important thing to think about. You are supposed to make your gifts fructify and grow and possibly double your money. Jesus wasn't obsessed with money, clearly in the Bible, and not that he wanted us to have a lot of it. That's not the point. The point is really he knew that money was more of a heart issue. It's not a financial issue. Yes, it's something that we need to run society, to purchase things and invest, but it's all too often one of the many stumbling blocks why people don't come to Christ, or why they reject Christianity, or why they leave Christianity, is money is a difficult topic. And the point that Jesus was making is that it's important, but it's not what you should focus on, and you should use it in a biblical way. The money that you have in your wallets or in your bank account doesn't have any value in and of itself. A $1 bill is just a promise by the Fed that the US government's going to back it. The coins you have, the money you have in your bank, it's all digital. I mean, it used to be tied to gold, but not since the 1970s. So technically, the money, that itself has no value in and of itself. And it's only really worth what the government says. The government could devalue the dollar. Some governments in Europe have done that quite frequently. Lots of zeros added to the Italian lira way back when. But it's essentially, the money itself is morally neutral, right? It doesn't really do anything. And we say, money is the root of all evil. It's not money. Right? The money in and of itself is just an instrument. It's just a means that we have invented here in human society to exchange, rather than a barter system where you exchange, use shells as coins, or you'd say, I'll give you, a thing of olive oil and you give me, sardines. That used to be the way it worked. Money just became this way of translating, and currencies became a way of translating. But the money in and of itself is powerless. It doesn't do anything. The devil loves money. And the devil uses money to seduce us and to use it in a negative direction. And that's where we have to be very careful. And the Bible also warns us of money becoming the center of our lives. The devil does want us to fall in love with money, so you become a slave to it rather than master of the money. And that's also part of what the Bible teaches us, is be careful to use the money for good, for the glory of God, for the building of his kingdom, and to do things that are right by God, as opposed to what the devil is going to tempt you to try and do with money and make you want even more. So the flip side from the devil's use of money is that if we invest the money for God's kingdom, it really becomes an instrument for good. And that's where tithing comes in, but also educating our children, bringing up our children, planning for retirement, planning for generational wealth, and hopefully future generations of Christians is one of the benefits of using your money for God's glory. Money is important because it drives our behaviors, especially in today's society. You have to worry about money. You have to pay bills, you have to pay rent, you have to pay for medical coverage, you have to pay for gas for the car. So it is part of everyday life, and how we behave around it in everyday society really defines who we are as Christians. And to take it further, I would say that how we behave with money is maybe a barometer of our spiritual condition and our spiritual health. If we're aware of it, you can kind of gauge how healthy is your spiritual life if you have a proper relationship with money. So when we hoard money, so if we kind of accumulate money, or if we become envious of other people because they have more money, or we spend money we don't have, so we accumulate debt, bad debt. There's good debt, but I'll talk about bad debt. If we just accumulate a spending spree and have a lifestyle that we just can't afford, there's a good chance that the devil's behind a lot of this. If that's where you focus on where your envy of money, your hoarding of money, your spending as if there was an endless amount of money, probably check in on where, if the devil isn't trying to influence you in the wrong direction, maybe who your acquaintances and the people you hang out with, how are they using money? And maybe they're not Christians, maybe they see money through a different lens. But this is, I think, a very important thing to focus on. How does money drive your behaviors? And where does your heart, where is your mind when you think of money and your personal finances? Jesus in Matthew 6 mentions that you can't have two masters, and you can't serve both God and money as your God. And using money for God's glory versus using money for your own glory or attempt at your own glory. That's the real distinction here that Jesus tries to make. You can't let money be your idol. You can't let money be your God, and wealth accumulation be the reason for your salvation, because it won't work. So let's switch over to some wisdom and common sense. And the first part I want to talk about is income. Now I'll just detail how the agenda is going to go for the next 4 Sundays. There are 2 types of income, active and passive, and I'll explain what those are. But in order to give back to God, you have to start with something. You have to have some form of income, unless you inherit it, but that's passive income. But you have to start with making money. And I'll talk about the various ways to make money. But then we'll talk about, first topic is once you have money, the first thing you should think about is tithing. Don't spend it, don't save it, give it back. And that's probably where we're going to end today's session, is income and tithing, because those are the most important topics. Then whatever's left over, you can spend. But for me, tithing has to come right after income. It's not after tax, it's not after you've paid all the bills, it's not after you've had some fun, gone on vacation. Tithing starts right at the top. And that's biblical. And I'll share some topics. And tithing, the percentage, et cetera, we'll dive into that, because a lot of people say, is it 10%? Is it mandatory? I'll talk about what the Bible says, Old Testament, New Testament. But for me, the order here is important. Tithing has to be top of mind. Right after you made money, first thing is, I have to give it back. Then we'll talk about expenses. So there's some mandatory expenses, what I call incompressible. You have to pay rent. Now you can find a cheaper place to live, but at some point you have to put a roof over your head or pay your mortgage. You have to put food on the table. Certain things you have to do. If you have to drive to work, you need gas, you need a car. Those are mandatory, obligatory expenses that you have. And then there's some things you need, and then there's some things you want. And it's kind of in that order that you have to prioritize where your expenses are. Then there's debt. And debt does make the world turn, and American society is very much a leveraged financial system where we have debt, and there's good debt. And I would say most mortgages, when you get a mortgage on a home, that's considered good debt because you put a roof over your head. You have a mortgage, some of the interest is deductible from your taxes. I'll talk about how that works. And usually your house over time appreciates. So you're building equity. and you get leverage. So it's a good form of debt if you have a good interest rate. Now, you don't want to get locked into some crazy interest rate, but usually mortgage is one of the ways to the American dream of home ownership. And paying off a mortgage is kind of one of the final objectives in your financial life. Then there's what I call neutral debt, car payments. You need a car to go to work. Okay, you don't have to get a Ferrari, but you have to buy a car. Now, bad car debt is when it's either too high, or you have a fancy car you can't afford, or you're not paying it down. And then student loans. College education is very expensive in the United States. A good college education, a good diploma, a useful skill developed in school, vocational school, that's good debt as long as you can pay it off. If you drag it on for the next 40 years, was that the right debt to incur? Because you didn't get a job or a vocation or career that allowed you to pay that down. Like if you go to law school and you're in $200,000 worth of debt because you went to law school, but don't become a lawyer, don't use that skill, and you have to pay that off for the next 30 years, is that good student debt? I would argue it isn't. So, and then bad debt, credit card debt. We all use credit cards, it's very convenient. Part of what I recommend is to get rid of credit card debt. Use them as debit cards. In other words, it comes out of your account every month. You pay it off and you pay no interest on it. Or if you have credit card debt, pay it down quickly. You get those 0% APR promotions, free money, and then 6 months later it's 24% interest. And then you're chasing down to pay that. And that's bad debt because that's wasted money. That could go to God's glory, could go to your savings, to your retirement. So my advice is always start with paying off the bad debt really fast and tightening the belt as quickly as possible. And that's part of the roadmaps that I'd like to develop with people that I spend time with on this, is getting rid of the bad debt and focusing on good debt, and eventually having no debt, eventually. But that's maybe later in life. Taxes. So we have to pay taxes, but you can legally do everything in your power to minimize them, to avoid them, or to optimize taxes. That is legal. That's a Supreme Court judgment that you are incentivized as a citizen to go find all the advice you can to reduce your taxes, as long as it's within the tax code. So you should do that. Find ways to write things off. Good debt like mortgage debt, which has some deductibility of the interest versus credit card debt. Yeah, you should absolutely do that. And there are new tax laws being passed, new tax packages. Take advantage of those and learn about them. Savings. So we'll talk about savings not only for kind of rainy day emergency funds, but there's savings you can do through your workplace, something called a 401k. Savings you can do on your own just to have money in case you want to buy a house or buy a car or have a big vacation. And there's both pre and post-tax savings. We'll talk about the differences there. Then there's this thing on the long-term horizon called retirement. Now, some of you are already there. But you still have to live for another 30, 40, hopefully 50 years, and you have to have enough money to live off of. And so planning for retirement, you can't wait till the day you say, I'm going to stop working, and say, oops, where's the money? You have to plan for that. And the benefit of being early in your career, early in life, is you have time, and time is the most powerful thing when it comes to finances. But planning for retirement requires you to take action now. And if you haven't, and you're close to retirement, I urge you to take action now. And if you are retired, you should still be looking at your finances like your business, right? You still have income, whether it's a pension, military, or your company, or Social Security. You still have expenses. You may still have a mortgage to pay. Being retired doesn't mean you don't have financial obligations. It just means you have less income coming in from a job. And then finally, once you've done all this, whatever's left over is for fun, right? But that's the last thing. You don't start with, I got my paycheck, I'm going to go Vegas and put it on the roulette table. That's not the first thing you do, right? But a lot of people do. A lot of people don't think through this list, this prioritized list of how do you manage your finances, and then have either what I call delayed gratification, plan for that future fun, or if you do have that excess money, and you've already tithed and done everything, then yeah, you should enjoy it, you should have fun. But that's the last thing to work on. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next 4 weeks. And we're going to dive into income. Income requires hard work, unless you're supremely gifted and, I don't know, you're like a pop star, but even then, or an athlete, there's still a lot of hard work to make money that appears to be easy. There is no easy money. It requires hard work. And the Psalms mention labor of your hands. We are commanded to work. and work to earn a living. So we need to make sure that we are doing that. The flip side is, God will reward you. You work hard, God will reward you, and that can come a variety of ways, salary, but other blessings that come from hard work. And if you have a solid work ethic, you work, every work day, you show up on time, you put in the extra effort, you deserve the outcome. Income is not an evil thing. Earning that money, putting in the hard work is deserved, but you have to put in the effort to begin with. And sloth is a sin. Not working means you have no income, unless you're retired or have other passive sources of income. But unless you work, the top line, the revenue, the income doesn't happen. So you have to work, which is why the last session of this 4-part series will be about get a job. If you don't have a job, get a job, right? And some of the kids we had at our church in New York, they couldn't find a job, they couldn't hold a job, and my admonition to them was, get a job, I don't care what it is. Deliver Uber Eats, do something. And I'll talk about the job market, but it is unacceptable not to work. If you are able and capable, you need to get a job. That is, biblical, and God commands us to work. You can get any kind of job. You can get a full-time job, part-time job, you can do gigs, Uber. Some people need 2 jobs. I encourage people, if you have credit card debt and you don't know how to make ends meet, get a second job. Get that second gig job. You can, UPS, FedEx, Uber, whatever it is, get the second job until you've paid that off. You need to put in the effort. And yeah, that's more work hours, maybe less sleep, but unless you do that, you're not going to close the circle on the things that need to be taken care of, paying off the debt, or making enough money to retire eventually. If you don't put in the effort now, it's not going to magically appear when you turn 65 or 70 and you decide you want to retire. It's godly. Always try to think through that lens. God wants you to work. Doesn't want you to be lazy, doesn't want you to just hope something falls in your lap and the money magically appears in your account. Doesn't happen. And playing the lottery, I don't think the Bible says too much about lottery, but the odds aren't good, trust me. So you need to get what's called active income. So active income is a salary, a paycheck, what's called the W-2 income. W-2 is the tax form that many of you probably get every year that you have to submit to the IRS. That's earned income that you get from showing up at work and you get a paycheck. You may have your own company and you pay yourself a W-2, so you pay yourself a salary. But that's the basics, is you have that top line, that income that comes in, and that's active because you're working. So for me, the main thing is if you're thinking of going back to school or you have kids that are in school, be pragmatic. Pick a degree, a diploma, a type of school, college, vocational school, a skill that has earning potential. If you pick something that's kind of whimsical, it might be fun, but it's not going to pay the bills. You don't all have to go to law school, medical school, whatever. There are plenty of vocational schools, plenty of skills that the world needs, that society needs, that can help you make a living. But you need to pick something that's pragmatic. And there are some diplomas, some degrees, some schools that honestly do not end up with job potential. So for those of you who have kids, grandkids, kids about to go to college, kids thinking about what they want to do, majors they want to go after, you can learn interesting stuff. Learning the classics, learning a foreign language, all these things are wonderful for your mind, for your soul. But you also have to think of, what can I do with these skills? What kind of job can I get? And the younger generation, look at Kai, for example, you're fortunate because your generation will be able to change jobs and careers and vocations more often than my generation and maybe some of the retired generation. I change jobs and careers pretty often, but it's rare for somebody of my age. Before you started a company, you'd stay there for 40 years, 50 years. You'd retire at that company. The younger generation, you're going to be able to change every 2 years, every 5 years, and switch. Go back to school, learn a new skill online. There's countless things you can do online to learn AI or coding. You can learn a lot now and change and pivot. So that's new. That's actually, I think, a blessing for the kids to be able to change. A lot of us kind of learned one skill and that's all we know and that's all we've done. And we're really good at that. But if somebody said you can't do that anymore, if that job doesn't exist, it's a little tough. So thinking about the earning potential of careers, or when do you want to pivot? Let's say there is kind of a dead end and your job disappears because AI took over or whatever. What new skill can you go learn that has earning potential? But always think of it through that lens. There are some wonderful hobbies and skills and things to do, but be pragmatic about the skills that you want to apply to earning potential. So active income is having a regular salary and a regular job, full-time, or you have a part-time job. I would encourage you to have 2 part-time jobs if that's the case, or doing occasional gigs, but you really have to hustle. When you talk to, I'm always taking the Uber down to Albuquerque or Santa Fe Airport, and I always talk to the drivers. They're hustling, they're working hard to make ends meet, and they have to put in the hours. But the real takeaway on active income is don't be slothful, get a job, get earning potential, and then move your career within the company so you get raises, you get bonuses, you get promotions. Being slothful within a career is probably not recommended either. Be, let's say, humbly ambitious, maybe the best way to put it. Aspire to, get maybe your boss's job one day, learn new skills, and get a salary increase. Right? Just kind of coasting, et cetera, means your salary probably won't move much, and certainly won't keep up with inflation. So find a job so you have income. A lot of people say, oh, it's tough to find a job, and et cetera, et cetera. This economy, the US economy certainly right now is strong. And it's not just the stock market, but in general, the US economy is strong. Maybe goes through a few recessional cycles occasionally, like the 2008, 2009 meltdown and COVID. But those are relatively rare events, honestly. And there are plenty of jobs today available across virtually every industry. There is no excuse in my mind. New Mexico is full of jobs. I'll show you a chart here in a moment. New Mexico has one of the lowest unemployment percentages in the country, lower than the average US. And you'll see that. So there's no excuse. I don't buy that. If somebody says I can't find a job, come and talk to me. There are plenty of jobs. Now, they may not be the ideal job, may not be whatever, and they're not all down in Las Cruces. You don't have to commute. There are plenty of jobs. Right? One of the things I recommend is always having your resume or curriculum vitae CV ready. And have for those of you who are on LinkedIn, if you're not on LinkedIn and you're looking to kind of get your career back in gear, LinkedIn is a useful tool. It's where people network for work, and you find people you can work with and learn from and get new jobs. I would say if you have to spend any time on social media, skip all the other Facebooks and Instagrams, et cetera. Spend time on LinkedIn, at least while you're job searching. It's relatively useful for that, to find jobs, find people to connect with, and just introduce yourself, get your resume out there, and use it as a job searching tool, not something just to show, cat videos. Yes, it was. And if you are going to be looking for a job, trust me, interviewing for a job is a full-time job in and of itself. So you have to find the time. If you're in a job and you want to find a new job, it takes a lot of extra time to interview. And I'm happy to share, hopefully in the fourth Sunday lesson, we can talk about interviewing and job search. But job searching is a full-time job in and of itself, so you have to carve out the time. But for me, there's really no excuse. And this part here, I'm also available for one-on-one coaching, mentoring, advising, and for some of the kids that want to start finding jobs. Happy to spend time, Kai, for example, with you, just looking at resumes and how do you interview and how do you make your resume pop. And get people's attention. So this chart shows unemployment in New Mexico as of August. 4.1. It's lowest it's been in 20 years. And it's lower than the US. There's no excuse. Even though New Mexico ranks 48th out of 50 on a whole bunch of stuff, unemployment, we're pretty good. There are plenty of jobs. Yes, there's oil and gas. Yes, there's military. Yes, there's tourism. But the entire infrastructure. You can be in finance, you can be a teacher, there are a million jobs, auto mechanic, there are tons of jobs. So I don't buy it if somebody says I can't find a job, there are jobs. Plenty of them. There are plenty of gigs, plenty of things you can do, so there's no excuse not to have income. And I'm leading up to the tithing part, so just, you have to get a job. But this should dispel any concerns that, oh, it's tough to find a job. No, it isn't. Now, how you go about finding a job may be the issue, but we can fix that part. But the opportunity is there. Okay, so we've covered income. Any questions on income before I switch over to tithing? Because I want to get through tithing this morning. And I mainly expect that because I expect tithing at the end of today's service to be record. Right? I'll get names. No, just kidding. Any questions on income before I switch over? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? This isn't the technical part, get a job, get a salary, have some earning. Now, if you're retired, here again, you have Social Security, you have your pension, you have, if you're former in the military, you have military pension. Yes, sir.
How do they work the average income for a certain job? Is that something that just society in itself does it according to what people can make?
Usually it's demand and supply. How many people are capable of that job and how much is that job in demand? So, doctors are paid relatively well because it takes 8 to 10 years to get the medical, specialization that you want. Uber driver would be the other extreme. And as long as you know how to drive, you can be an Uber driver. Doesn't require, a diploma. So it's the hourly wage is kind of market, right? Market rate. Some jobs, right now retail has a tough time, getting store clerks. So they have to throw, higher wages, hourly wages, benefits. So the fact that the job market is still tight is a good thing for people looking for jobs because they have to pay more to attract you. And the younger generation is more fickle. The younger generation will move. They'll say, I don't like my boss, I don't like this job, or I can get paid better, so I'm gonna leave. So the company invested 2 years into training you, and then you're like, I'm out of here. And so companies have that churn and attrition is really tough in companies. For those of you who work in large companies, the churn rate or the attrition rate is something we have to deal with. The war for talent is still very, very active. So it's a good thing for people who want jobs, right? So people are willing to pay more and pay more benefits, more hourly wage. But it's demand and supply in the market is really what usually determines wages. Let's switch over to tithing. So, tithing. It's in the Bible. So I can end the lesson. It's in the Bible. God commands you to do it. The Old Testament says 10%. I often get the question, is it 10% like mandatory? What happens? Do I get struck by lightning if I don't hit the 10% mark? Who's going to check? We'll talk about the 10%. Do I do whatever percentage pre-tax or post-tax? I get that question a lot. And there's a difference, and I'll show you an example. It's a habit. It's a muscle to develop. Here at City of Faith, we don't talk about money. We don't talk about the offering. Some churches, will say, now we'll have a time of offering. People go around with plates. We have a giving box here, and some people automate things and do it online through PayPal and other systems, but we don't talk about it much. So even visitors who should contribute and give, they probably walk out, don't even notice that we have a box. Unless they read the program, we talk about the giving. Brenda puts that at the bottom every month. Every week we see the monthly tally. But it's a habit. And it's a habit we need to develop and be strict about it. You can't skip a Sunday. You can't say, I'm not going to tithe right now because I don't feel like it. So we'll talk about the habit. And then I love this, I'll talk about a very practical example. Right now is like the orange spice, whatever, soy frappuccino, pumpkin spice doesn't exist, I don't know. I don't do those. Anyway, there's a dilemma. Like, do you get the pumpkin spice soy latte frappuccino thing from Starbucks, or do we pay Frank? I don't know, but I know which choice I'd make. So this is, I think, one of the most powerful quotes in the Bible about tithing. And I know Jennifer and I talk about this. Malachi, are you robbing God? I mean, what a terrible thing to think about. Are you stealing from God? It's his to begin with. But if you aren't tithing, you're robbing the creator of the universe. Who do we think we are? Trying to rob God. Very powerful. Old Testament, but I think it's still very, very applicable in the New Testament times. Is tithing, If you don't tithe, you're taking away from God what was his to begin with. He gave it to you graciously. And if you aren't giving back, he's going to think you're robbing him. It's kind of a scary thought. Not that I want to scare you into tithing, but God thinks it's pretty scary. And we should be afraid of this. If we aren't tithing, we are robbing God. The poor widow, who basically puts in her entire wealth, is giving more than the rich people who are actually tithing 10%. So think also, it's not the actual amount, it's how sacrificial, how generous is the giving relative to what you've already been given as a gift. It's easy for a bazillionaire to give away $1 billion because they have hundreds of it. But what if they gave away 10%? Somebody who's making minimum wage that is tithing is actually more biblical than the person who gives away, a large amount of money, but it is not commensurate with what they have. So another interesting parable, an example here of sacrificial giving is relative to what you've been given to begin with. It's not a dollar amount. It's, does it hurt a little bit? Is it something that is a little painful, but you'll get the rewards once you've done it? God has killed a few people in church for not tithing appropriately. I know Pastor Frank says, God kills people in church. So try to scare you into tithing here, but it's real, right? And our dear friends Ananias and Sapphira, right? They lied about the proceeds they made on selling a field, and they were struck down in the middle of church. No matter what your plan was your plan to give the entire proceeds, to tithe on it? They lied about it. And they were struck down. Pretty early in the Bible, too, in the New Testament. So either you're robbing God or you're going to get struck by lightning in church if you don't tithe. Or you get that soy frappuccino, whatever thing. But these are scary biblical truths that we need to take into account. Tithing is not just, I'll think about it, I'll do it occasionally. If you don't do it, or you lie about it, or you withhold, it's not biblical. Yeah, and his wife came in a little bit later and she got struck down because she lied about it too, so be consistent. Tithing. My understanding, and here again, if I've said anything heretical, Pastor Frank, please forgive me. My understanding is that the 10% tithe is Old Testament. It is no longer applicable per se in the New Testament. It's not a hard requirement. And I believe there are a couple of passages in the Bible that mention that, the example of the widow, for example. So 10% was the tradition in the Old Testament. A lot of people gave more, actually. Taxes were a lot lower in those times too. People had maybe a little bit more disposable income, but 10% was kind of the minimum threshold, and you could give more, but 10 was kind of the minimum. The biblical requirement, as of the New Testament, is generous and sacrificial giving. Does it hurt a little bit, and are you being generous or stingy with what God has given you? And that's really kind of a judgment call for all of you. Each one has your own situation, but is it sacrificial? Are you consistent with, hey, every time I get an increase, a bonus, an inheritance, or whatever, am I tithing on that? Or am I just keeping it for myself? Oh, I got that bonus. I'm not going to tithe on that. The Bible doesn't say you have to tithe on the bonus. I got a salary increase. I'm not going to tithe more. Why would I do that? Not biblical. It really comes down to as one is able. You still need to put food on the table, roof over your head. You can't give everything away like the widow did, because then you have nothing. Then you can't earn, you can't. So there's a limit to how sacrificial it is. But it has to hurt a little bit. You have to tighten the belt and make it meaningful for, it has to impact your financials and hopefully be meaningful for the church. But that's less relevant. If you contribute $1 because that's all you can afford, in the grand scheme of the church finances, the dollar's not going to make a huge difference. But for God, it makes a difference because it's sacrificial, and as you're able to, it's generous. So my advice is start with 10%. You might as well start with the first number they give us in the Bible. Start with 10%, and then you can pivot around that. Is 10% achievable? Is it too little, too much? Does it hurt? Could I give more? But just do the math. You make X amount of dollars on your income. What's 10%? And 10% is the easiest math you can do. Move the decimal point one way. And you know, and that should be your annual target to begin with. So I would encourage you to go do this homework at home. Look at how much income, all your paychecks, whatever sources of income. Move the decimal point over to the left. Are you giving that to the church every single year? And if you're well below that, there's some math for you to do now. Or maybe there's a reason. Maybe 10% is just, you can't. But start with that as the benchmark, as the goalpost to begin with. Some can give a lot more, right? Some people can afford 15%, 20%, 40%, some only 5%. That's fine, as long as it's generous and sacrificial. So it's not a hard, fast rule, but I encourage you to start with 10 and say, ooh, I didn't realize that. Now 10% spread out over 12 months, spread out over 4 weeks every month, 52 weeks a year, maybe that's possible. Every Sunday I could do that. Doesn't have to be all in one fell swoop. Now if you get a bonus, you want to tithe, right after that bonus. You get a salary increase, you bump up your tithing for the next year, right? You inherit something. Should you tithe on inheritance? I think you should. Right? You sell a piece of property. Don't lie about it, or you'll be struck down. And should you tithe on the proceeds of selling a home? I'd say probably yes. You should at least think about it. Have that active thought and conversation with your spouse. We should tithe on the proceeds, no matter what the income is. Right? Should you tithe on Social Security, on your military pension? Yes. Bible doesn't call out specifically military pensions, but it's your income, right? And as Jesus pointed out, it's more of a heart issue. Does it sit well with you when you tithe? Do you feel like it's sacrificial? Is it generous? Are you holding back? Are you stingy? Are you lying about it? Pretending? Or making sure people see how much you tithe, even though it's probably not the right amount to begin with. So think of it through your heart. Is your tithing coming from your heart, not just your wallet? And I've found that, and I'm sure a lot of you feel this, that giving can be so joyful, even when it's sacrificial, even when it hurts a little bit, it feels good. It's not something we should flaunt. Actually, it should be confidential. People don't need to know how much you give. Right? I think the only person here who probably knows is probably Brenda. And that's the way it should be, right? But it should feel joyful to give, to be generous, to be sacrificial. And that inner joy, you don't have to flaunt in front of everybody, just keep it to yourself. But that's a wonderful feeling that you should all get every time you tithe. Taking care of our pastor, that's the first reason why we tithe. Giving back to God, but we give back to our pastor, our shepherd here at City of Faith. And making sure that we take care of our pastor is, I believe, one of our first duties as a congregation. Showing up at church, obviously, at the local church, as we do here every Sunday. But as members of this church, we promise, according to our various abilities, to share in the provision for our pastor. And God ordained that people that preach, pastors that preach the gospel, need to be able to live by the gospel. Our pastor shouldn't have to have 2 other gigs to provide for his family. Pastor Frank should not have 2 other jobs, a night shift, an Uber gig. Our responsibility as a congregation to make sure he has a living wage and can put food on the table, roof over his head, take care of his kids, educate his kids. And Paul says this in 1 Corinthians. This is the exhortation we have, is we need to take care of our pastor generously. I know it's an uncomfortable topic. I know Pastor Frank, he can't be the one saying, hey, pay me. But that's our job as a congregation. And even visitors, they should be grateful to have a wonderful pastor up here preaching God's word faithfully. And they should contribute to thanking the pastor by giving and tithing. But that is one of our main roles as a congregation, is to pay our pastor and not be cheap. Because otherwise, the pastor's going to have to go find another job somewhere or leave or stop being a pastor because they can't make ends meet. They need a living wage too. They have the same expenses, the same stuff I've been talking about. A pastor also has to tithe. So, I mean, they have the same pressures we do. They have a different job, right? So that's our responsibility as a congregation. So let me give some examples here of tithing. So these are some quick math here. If you make $100, just keep the math very simple, and you don't tithe pre-tax, so you don't like say, I got my paycheck, the gross amount that I got in my bank account, and I'm gonna tithe. If you don't do that, let's say you pay 30% tax. So New Mexico is about 5%. Let's say you're paying 25% in federal tax. So 30%, $30 just go away. Go to Uncle Sam. And you don't tithe it all after tax either. You bring back $70 home, and Uncle Sam gets 30, and the church gets 0. So that's somebody who doesn't tithe, right? Pre-tax tithing, you have the $100. Let's say you want to tithe 10%. You put 10% in the box, and you pay taxes on the $90. You now pay $27 in taxes. You don't pay don't tithe after tax. Your take home is 63, so yes, lower than the 70, but you've given 10 to the church. Uncle Sam only gets 27. Oh. Thank you, yes. Missed the click on that one. So here you've basically robbed Uncle Sam, not a bad thing, because you're allowed to, and given it to the church, back to God, right? Now, if you do what's called after-tax tithing, so instead of taking the gross amount and tithing the 10% off of that, say I'm going to pay 30% taxes, I'm going to then take 10% of what I get, which is 70, so I'm going to give $7 to the church. My take-home is still 63, but I've only given 7 to the church, and Uncle Sam got his 30. Which of those 3 scenarios is the one we should follow? In my opinion, pre-tax tithing. Give it to God, give it to our pastor, give it to our church, not to Uncle Sam. Just prioritizing how you look at the math. If you pay taxes, you've already given it to the government. And yeah, you should give back, pay our taxes, et cetera, but minimizing taxes and maximizing giving and giving it back to God, probably the right priority. Now, if this is kind of complicated and technical, I'm happy to sit down with you, but I believe the lens through which you should be looking at financials is on a pre-tax basis. The gifts that God gives you, gross, should be what you give back to God and tithe on. So, let's talk about the pumpkin spice latte. First of all, it's 470 calories. And I'm worried for your health. So, that thing costs $6.25, maybe more, I don't know, I don't buy these, but I hear they're expensive. So, not only is it 470 calories, but you buy those 5 days a week. Okay, you take the weekends off, right? But you get it on your commute into work. That's $1,625 of after-tax money spent on pumpkin spice, which does not exist. Pumpkin spice is not a spice, just for your... Okay, which when you convert back to pre-tax dollars, so basically before you've paid the taxes, that's $2,300 a year on a massively caloric drink, which doesn't taste good. And I'm not judging. So first of all, that's 122,000 calories, which means you have to run an hour every day, 5 days a week, just to burn that off on average. So if you're going to do that, you got to run. Secondly, pre-tax tithing, you could basically be giving $50 a week in pre-tax. That feeds our pastor. That's the trade-off you're making, right, between the two. Do you really need that Frappuccino, orange spice, pumpkin latte thingy? And its calories. And the carbon footprint. Or do you feed our pastor? So, church is a business too, right? And I'll wrap up here. We just have a few minutes. We have to pay our pastor's salary, benefits, Health coverage, inflation on all these things. Cost of living for a pastor isn't stable. It goes up with the economy. So Pastor Frank's rent and the food and all these other things, they go up every year, 3% minimum, 4%. We have to keep up with that. Our tithing should keep up at a minimum, not to mention a salary increase for our pastor. All of us get salary increases in our jobs. Why shouldn't a pastor? We'll pay him by the sermon or, whatever. But we need to think of that, right, over time. Our church has missions and some charitable activities. That's also part of the expense of our church. We have operational expenses, the AV equipment, electricity, water, supplies in the nursery, communion supplies. These don't come for free. We have to buy them. Should we have an emergency fund if something happens to one of our congregants, one of our members? Yeah, a good church should have an emergency fund, either because something happens to the building, a flood, whatever, or one of our brothers or sisters in Christ has a cataclysmic event. The church usually should be there to help. We have guest preachers that spend time, fly out here, that preach the word faithfully. A stipend is always welcome. Baptisms, moving all the equipment, the water, etc., that's not necessarily free, right? Conferences, whether it's, the men we went off to Shepherd's Conference or Pastor Frank keeping his education fresh, how do we make sure we pay for his continuous, learning of the Word? And just the building cost. The building from a year and a half ago when we first joined this is miraculous. It's beautiful, but it's going to need upkeep. And there are more projects I know that the church has. We have to have a building fund or some kind of extra fund that we build over time to keep it up and to build new things, to make this an even better place to worship. So there are a lot of expenses beyond just the pastor's salary. So think of that also as you put your tithing envelope or pay online. This is a real business called the church that has financial pressures. It's not it's a nonprofit, but it still needs profit to run, right? So I know I need to wrap up right now. So let me just wrap up here with, what God calls us to do is pray about it, first and foremost. What is God calling you to do? Give generously, particularly as the holidays come up, catch up. If you do the math and say, I didn't give enough at the beginning of this year, my pace hasn't been, you have 3 months to catch up. Catch up now, right? The church's expenses don't stop just because you stop giving. Right? We still have to pay the pastor, pay the electricity bill. The business of the church never stops. You go on vacation, catch up your tithing. Do the math. When you come back, write a bigger check for the 2 weeks that you were out. Don't just skip it and say, I wasn't around, so I shouldn't pay. No, you have to pay every single week or every month or whatever your pace is, but do the math and catch up on your payments. Because the business of Pastor Frank and his family, that doesn't stop. So look at how many Sundays you missed this year. Go back. Did you miss any? Did you tithe or not tithe on those Sundays? If you're going to miss some because of the holidays, pay it in advance. If you know you're not going to be here between Christmas and New Year's, tithe the week before so you don't forget. Increase your giving to make that up. So just 3 months left. That's 12 Sundays, 13 Sundays between now and the end of the year. Just spread that out over the next few Sundays. Tithe if you get a bonus at the end of the year, if you get a new job or a promotion, a salary increase, factor that in, especially for the new year. If you have a new job starting January 1st, bump your tithing up. And by doing that, you can also maximize your 2025 tax deductions. If you don't know what that means, it means you can basically steal from Uncle Sam and give to God. And the more you give to God, the less you give to Uncle Sam, and you can make the math work with what's called pre-tax deductions of your, and Brenda gives you a letter that says, here's how much you gave, you submit that to your tax preparer, and it's free money. Free money for the church and prevents it from going to the government. I'm going to pause here, because I believe our music colleagues need to come up here. We will pick up next Sunday, we'll wrap up tithing, and then at some point get to the fun part. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in 30 minutes.